Welcome to this episode of Bounded in a Nutshell. Remember to take a moment to click on the link below to donate to a very special organization. Figure Skating in Harlem is the first organization in the world to combine the power of education with the grace and discipline of figure skating. It is dedicated to developing confidence, leadership, and academic achievement in young girls from low-income backgrounds. The numerous stories of success from its alumni owe a great deal to the unique blend of mentoring and self-expression that is championed by FSH. Remember, no donation is too small or too large to keep the dream alive for these exceptional young girls. Thank you very much. Enjoy the show.
In 1995, one of the truly great collaborative partnerships would begin when she was taken under the wings of George C. Wolfe, the artistic director of The Public. Their collaboration, which continues to this day, has included such huge Broadway hits as Bring in the Noise, Bring in the Funk, On the Town, Lucky Guy, Caroline and Change, Top Dog, Underdog, Shuffle Along. I remember you asking me if I could sing or tap for that one. And The Iceman currently one half of the dynamic duo alongside Jordan Thaler at the Public Theatre. She has masterminded the casting of some of the most memorable off-Broadway productions of the last 2 decades, many of them Merchant of Venice, Fun Home, Eclipse, Sweat, Girl from the North Country, making the inevitable Broadway transfer. Heidi is a repeat offender, returning to work with directors and creatives, forming long-lasting relationships. See aforementioned George C. Wolfe, Ivo Van Hove, Susan Laurie Parks, Kenny Leon, Kate Wariski, Dan Sullivan, to name a few. Her rare ventures into film have revealed a Midas touch in that medium as well, most recently winning the Artios Prize for Astounding Achievement from the Casting Society of America for Greta Gerwig's Lady Bird. Heidi is genuine as she is intuitive. Her ability to foster a welcoming, creative, and supportive environment for the auditioning actor, regardless of how big or small the role is, makes her not only one of the best in the business, but also, at least in my modest opinion, one of the most cherished. Welcome, Heidi, to the show.
Thank you for welcoming me so warmly. I'm really, really happy to be here.
I'm so glad you are, because you were one of the first people I thought had to be on this show, especially as we're focusing not just on the industry, and there's a lot of people just dying to talk to you about that, but also because, as I think I've talked to you before, we formed something quite rare in the industry, which is actually a real friendship, because I think you have a genuine interest in the actors you like to work with. So anyway, we'll jump onto that later on, but let's start from the beginning. Tell us a little bit about West Germany and how you go from that to finding yourself in the States, running marathons across the world, across the country, and here in New York.
I feel like we need about 8 hours to tell all of those threads of the story. But my father was teaching on an Air Force base in Germany, and I wish I could remember more of that experience, but we moved back to the UK when I was 4. Mm-hmm. I grew up in Kent, as you said, during a time in the UK where there was an enormous amount of money pouring into arts education. And I think probably for me, that's sort of where the bug bit me, because I was lucky enough to live not far from Canterbury, and Canterbury had a fantastic theatre called the Marlowe, and the Marlowe Theatre had a mobile Shakespeare unit. Mm. And so when I was in elementary school, we had visits from Marlowe Mobile, and I think that was the first time I ever saw Shakespeare, or even before I think I'd even read a word of Shakespeare. I was experiencing these incredibly playful and visceral productions, in the gymnasium at my elementary school, and then eventually at my high school. And it was the 70s was such an amazing time in that regard, because there was such respect and support for the arts. And I think it sort of created a generation of people who were able to imagine for themselves a career in the arts. And although, my parents they were both teachers, and they were very much keen on me having what my father would always say, a second string to your bow.
Yeah.
I resolutely decided I did not want that, and all I ever wanted from as long as I can remember, well, except when I wanted to be a jockey when I was about 7. But
you wanted to be a jockey?
Yeah. But other than that, all I can remember wanting to do was work in the theatre. So lucky me. But I do sort of think that having early exposure to really sort of wonderful work was a massive key.
And I think that's really, that was actually sadly quite a unique thing, because often the early exposure to Shakespeare is a bit dreary in curriculum. You read, you know, a passage within a play for half the semester and then write an essay on it with no real infusion into the world of Shakespeare. And also, your education into Shakespeare was a lot more, I guess, fun and actually holistic than most students, even in England, would be exposed to, right?
Yeah, I mean, it might be slightly a slight heresy to say this, but I think, you know, I think I was acute. I mean, we also studied Shakespeare in English literature classes.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, I did understand very early on that Shakespeare was for performing. It wasn't for reading.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, unfortunately, a lot of people aren't sort of offered that lens to sort of make connection to the work. I mean, there was a theatre company that came out of the southeast, out of Cornwall, called Footspan. And when I was in my early teens, I would go down in the summers and see these incredible productions of Shakespeare. I mean, there was a production of Hamlet I saw in a tent in Penzance, put on by this incredible company, Footspan, that I will never, ever forget.
Wow.
And so I think that gave me such an appetite, sitting in a tent, smelling the grass, these wonderful, inventive, generous, crazy actors, no more than, well, I was going to say as close together as you and I are now, but of course.
Yeah. Not really. Well, in your mind's
really,
eye.
but you know, just that, you know, like the sense of it being a living, breathing experience was something that I have always, you know, I look for that, you know, every time I go to the theatre.
Wow. So you have that childhood in Kent and, you know, traveling around, and then you end up at Hull for your BA.
Yeah.
What do you study at Hull, up north?
Well, I think here, I think here it would be called theatre, but of course
Yes.
then it was called drama. I do love secretly that I have a degree in drama.
Yeah. Very useful, that second string. You know, and then Smith College, how did that happen? What brought that on?
I think Smith was really a little bit about postponing the inevitable. You know, when you get a degree that's a sort of a generalized degree, as opposed to a degree in acting or directing, or, you know, I had this sense that I wanted to direct. Like, my undergrad taught me two very, very crucial things. One was that I loved actors. And the second was that I was way too cowardly to be an actor myself. And so I dabbled a bit in directing, and I sort of thought that might be my path, but I couldn't really figure out sort of how to get from where I was to where I wanted to be. So I thought, well, let me do a master's, and that will just give me some time to sort of
figure it out.
Think about it all, and sort of try to find some clarity on what that path might be. So, you know, Smith College was kind enough to give me ridiculous amounts of money, and so off I went. And again, it was just a wonderful opportunity to sort of meet, you know, different kinds of people. In the first week that I was in Massachusetts, I met a theatre company from New York called Split Britches. It was 3 women. And they came and taught some workshops and did one of their productions. And I just fell in love with all of them. And basically I thought, I'm gonna go to New York. And so I sort of stayed in touch. And then they came back about a year later to do, interestingly, a production of an Ionesco play that I had always loved.
Not the Rhinoceros.
No. The Chairs.
Oh, right, yeah.
Still one of my favorite plays in the world. And I basically ran away and joined the circus. I took off. I was like at the point where I had to just write a thesis. And so I was like, well, I could do that in New York. And so I sort of packed my bag, which was all I had, and moved to New York.
Wow.
And started working at an off Broadway theater called the Wow Cafe, which was a feminist lesbian collective that the women from Split Britches had founded. And so I started just doing work. And again, without a real plan, except that I just wanted to sort of be around people that seemed to love theatre.
Did this company have a base in New York? Where
Yeah,
were they located?
there was a space on the third floor of a building on East 4th Street, just on the same block as New York Theatre Workshop and La Mama and the Rod Rogers Dance Company. Like that block on 4th Street between 2nd and 3rd was like the most creative block in all of New York City, I think.
Wow. Now you can't, afford a garage.
Correct. And it was a city building, and so I think the rent for the theatre was like, I don't know, $100 a month or something ridiculous. And so, a whole crazy gang of us sort of would meet there, and it was run as a collective, and so that was challenging and interesting and crazy.
And was your job with them in the casting side, or were you?
No. I mean, nobody had jobs. I mean, we all. It was so free. You could sort of. All you had to do was say, "I have an idea," and there would be all of these people, these women, who would say, I can help you make that happen. But the idea was that if I wanted to direct, some crazy show, then somebody else would design the costumes for me. Somebody else would design the set. And in return, I would then run lights for someone else's show, or I would be the front of house manager or clean the bathroom. But we were all doing a bit of everything.
Here's a question. If that was a sustainable lifestyle, as in financially sustainable in New York, that sort of freedom, shall we say, to dabble, and I guess in an organization, in a group like that, the fear of failure doesn't really exist. You just get on with it. Would that be for you a more ideal setting as a creative? Or do you like a bit more structure? Do you like a bit more focus and this is what I do now and stuff? Or does that...
Yes,
I know that's a heavy question. I just loaded you with a big question. It's just that I feel that world is shrinking more and more, the harder and harder it gets to produce stuff in the sense of financially and stuff, whether there is a bygone, nostalgia for that,
Yeah, I mean, again, it sort of goes back a little bit to what I was saying about times where there was respect for and support of the arts. I mean, the time that I'm talking about is, New York in the early mid 80s, where, New York State Council for the Arts, was, had loads of money that they were sort of bestowing upon people. There was government support for art, and it was, it wasn't just sort of the public theatre. It was all of these little tiny, theatre companies that existed all over. And I do think some of that's been lost because the city has just become a crazy expensive place. I mean, we were all living in the East Village for the most part, and we all paid relatively, reasonable rents. And, I think when I first moved to New York, I was paying $250 a month rent, but and so
that's a week's groceries at Whole Foods now.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. But I think I don't remember spending money on groceries. I suppose we must have eaten, but I don't remember that.
So you're there, and you mentioned the funding and organization. I mean, one of that sort of funding is what allowed one of your first bosses, Joe Papp, to start the New York Shakespeare Festival and everything like that. Tell us about meeting him.
Well, it was I only actually met Joe after I had a job at the Public. So there's a little bit of do you want to hear this little bit of that?
The bit in between.
I'm going to link these two little sort of sections of life. Yeah. So all the work I was doing at WOW was incredible and creatively unbelievably fulfilling, but nobody got paid, and so we all did other kind of crazy things to pay the rent. So I was painting houses, I was doing restoration of stonework, I was doing all kinds of things like that. And I got to a point where I thought, you know what, I need to give it one really good go to see if I can actually make a living in the theatre and not have to have these two sort of separate parts of my life. And so I got a job. The first thing I did was I got a job at the Drama Bookshop, which was such an amazing place for people to sort of meet and sort of connect to work. And I loved working there, and I worked there on the weekends. And I used to, Sundays were a bit slow, and so I used to read a lot, and I would read plays, and I picked up this book called Backstage, and it was actually a British book, and it was written by a woman who was interested in finding out how the people that did all the things that are not the obvious things. So no actors, no directors, no playwrights, but all of the people involved in making theatre in every other regard. And one of the people that was interviewed was the first ever casting director at the Royal Shakespeare Company. And she didn't start out as a casting director. She was the assistant to the then artistic director. And over time, part of her job became sort of reaching out to actors and knowing where people were and what their commitments were, so that she could sort of feed different actors into conversations about what the company should look like for a given season. And then that ended up being her entire field of expertise.
Wow.
And so she then finally became, casting is a field that has only existed for 50 years.
Absolutely.
50 years.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, that is really interesting. Like, I'd never thought, even when I was sort of directing in college and then in New York, I'd never thought, that there were people whose field of expertise was connected to actors. Yeah. And so I thought, well, let me investigate that. And so I wrote a letter, as you did, because I had seen that there was an internship in casting at the Public. And so I wrote a letter to the general manager, and he passed it on to the woman who was then the head of the casting department, Rosemary Tischler. And, without Rosemary and her sort of faith in me, I absolutely would not be sitting here talking to you today. And I absolutely would not have had the incredible joy to work at the Public for as many years as I have. She took a big chance on me. I was this kind of like bobble-headed 25-year-old, who, had no idea really what she was walking into. I just thought it sounded really interesting. And, from the letter that I had written, Rosemary knew I couldn't spell to save my life. And this was before like spell check or anything helpful.
Spell check, oh God.
And so
without spell check or grammar check, or indeed my roommate, I don't think I'd have graduated here. I don't think. Okay, let's and so you wrote this letter, you got it into the Public, because I think you said you had like 3 different rounds of time at the Public, right?
That's right. I started as an intern. It was a 6-month gig, and after the 6 months, I was sort of very against my hopes and dreams. I was kicked out into the world, and I worked briefly for Manhattan Theatre Club for the casting directors there. And then after about 4 months, the assistant who had been at the Public while I was the intern moved to LA. And so they asked me to come back as the assistant. Right. So I was there when, just trying to remember the exact, I guess it was right as sort of the transition from, Joe was not well, and so he was sort of transitioning leadership. And so there were these crazy, wonderful seasons where he gave, the Public has 5 spaces. Yeah. And he gave a space to a different director. And that it was their purview was to plan a season in their space for themselves.
Wow.
And so one of those was Joanne Acolytus, one was George Wolfe, one was Michael Greif, one was the brilliant David Greenspan. And they were a mix, George and David were sort of writer-directors, Joanne and Michael Greif were director-directors. And it was an amazing time because sort of they had the freedom to do whatever they wanted, and in their spaces. It was really, really thrilling.
Wow.
And then, Joe got very sick. Joanne took over, and it was a very, very difficult time. And I think that sort of whoever was going to sort of step into the breach, was going to have the most horrendously difficult time. And it was really tough for Joanne. And so there was a period of sort of contraction, and then I was laid off after being there for about 2.5 years. And I went to work for an incredible legend in the casting world, Meg Simon. And she again, she sort of like, I don't know why, but she decided I would be worth the
effort,
price.
the training.
And I had 3 incredible years working with her. She at that time, almost any play that was on Broadway. So we're talking now sort of like 93 to 95, I guess, Meg cast. And so I got to work on some amazing, amazing projects, including Angels in America.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And so then the third time you after Meg came back under George.
Yes.
And that formed this ridiculous collaboration of Broadway hit after hit after hit. What is it, do you think that, I mean, we're going to soon shift the conversation between relationship between casting director and actor. Yeah. What is that thing about casting director and director? You know, how do you, what is the bond you're looking for, do you think? I mean, how much say do you get? You like someone, George doesn't, but you're like, I mean, how much say do you have in convincing George? How much does he give to you? I mean, I'm just always intrigued by those conversations we never hear of. You know?
Well, so I think there's sort of two things in there, Chuck. So, you know, the first one is that sort of building those relationships takes time and care, like building any relationship does.
Right.
And sometimes you don't have the opportunity. You know, if you only have the chance to work with somebody once, the chances are that you're not going to have the same depth of relationship and sort of collaborative freedom, perhaps, as I might with someone like George or Dan Sullivan, you know, who I've worked with, you know, or Lee Silverman, who I've worked with, you know, many times. And sometimes you just have to accept that not all relationships are created equally, and that's okay. You know, there are sometimes processes that are very difficult to navigate. But one of the beauties of working at an institution like the Public is that, you know, it's a constantly, you know, it's a pool of sort of collaborators that's constantly being refreshed.
You're
so
right.
if you have a tricky time with somebody, and of course, you know, that's always going to happen. Chances are a couple of months will go by and you move on. And then somebody, you know, somebody that you do sort of connect with comes along. But I think Jordan and I have been very, very lucky over the years that the vast majority of directors that we've worked with have, you know, we've developed really wonderful relationships with. And, you know, the second part of it, I think what you were sort of wanting to dig into is what's the experience like of actually sort of trying to have that mind meld with somebody, and of course it's a million times easier when you know the director, because you know you're sort of halfway, you know, you're halfway to the finish line already, because you know things about their taste, and so you can immediately start to sort of think about actors who you know
they will like.
Whilst all the time trying to a little bit sort of challenge and maybe develop that taste.
Now, the challenging and developing, you know, every now and then talking to you, I know you do that. You're one of those who, when you believe in an artist, you really do fight for them. And I guess maybe that's just something all casting directors do. I don't know, but I get the sense with you that you don't hesitate at bringing someone in that might be completely different from what the director was thinking of initially, maybe because of that trust you're talking about.
Yes.
And, yeah,
that's right. But the thing that I think we always have to try to keep, you know, very clear sight of is that, you know, the director is the person that is going to have to work with the actor for 6 weeks, not me. And so in the end, it doesn't really matter, you know, who I would choose.
Right.
And so we walk a very sort of fine line. Directors will often ask us, you know, who do you prefer? And, you know, we try very, very hard to sort of deflect and turn that question into questions about the role, you know. And so then you can have a real conversation. If a director can clarify something that's really important to them about the role, or how the role sort of connects, you know, to other characters or to the storytelling, then we can have a conversation about what we know about actors, and so maybe help them in that way to sort of sort out for themselves, you know, who the best fit would be.
Yeah. Because in a weird way, it's like you're like the parent and being asked to choose your favorite sometimes, I guess. I mean, I think of that, you know, when I was in the room with casting with you for Othello, you know, when we were looking for that will always be one of the most important experiences for me, both as an actor and in the room. And we were looking for the Emilia and Desdemona. And they were all people you clearly cared about and believed in their ability and felt they should be in the room at that stage. And then that question comes up, which one should be? I'm so glad I wasn't, after, you know, doing the auditions with them, I'm so glad I wasn't part of that final decision making, because it must be really weird for you when the work is great. I mean, this is really important for a lot of actors tuning in here, because Heidi, in fact, I'd like you to talk a bit about the fact that not getting the job doesn't mean you did anything wrong. You know what I mean? You know?
That is, you have just spoken one of the great truths of our world, I think, Chuck. You know, so here's the thing that I treasure more than anything else about my job, which is that I get to see some of the greatest performances that nobody else gets to see. You know, because, you know, it's such the decisions that are made are so sometimes, you know, intangible, the reasons.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, it's something in the end that is, you know, it's more important to me that Dan Sullivan is happy and
Yes.
that Oscar is happy than it is that I'm happy.
Right.
You know, and so, you know, if we can get to the end of a process as we did with Othello, where, you know, we were just so, I mean, it was
the talent that came into that room was obscene.
To have choices. I mean, the thing as a casting director that you dread is not having any choices. But to have 4 or 5 choices for roles that are as challenging as those roles are, I just felt, you know, it's just a blessing. And so, you know, so at that point, I really do feel like then that's my moment to sort of step back and then let Dan really, or Oscar or George or whoever the director is, you know, think about sort of who they think they will work with the best, who they think will fit sort of the most beautifully with the company that's been assembled, you know, all of those kinds of things. And I'm not sort of you know, I'm not sort of shirking responsibility, but it is so genuinely not for me, you know, to sort of say, oh, I think you've made a terrible mistake. And honestly, like the couple of times in my career where I feel like I have sort of slightly influenced a director's choice, it's never gone well. You know,
really?
You know, trying to sort of get a director to cast somebody because you think it's the right choice, that is nothing happy will come from that. Has been my experience.
So here, to even narrow down that question, we still joke about this. I maintain, and I certainly do too, whenever I talk to young actors, that I still believe that, not my first, I kept saying it was my first, but I think my first was meeting you with Kenny Leon. That was the first time, but was that before
that
was before Antony and Cleopatra, I think, wasn't it?
I thought it was
because we had 2 meetings with Antony and Cleopatra. Maybe that was the first. No, I'm wrong. That was after Antony and Cleopatra. So the first meeting of Antony and Cleopatra. This is me using a personal experience to pass on the message. People, I maintain to this day, was an shite audition. Excuse my French. I hope that's okay. Like I just felt I was. It was slightly a fish out of water in the States. I'd just moved over. I'd moved from my comfort zone in London over to England. The first mad pilot, and the first pilot had shot my first pilot, and then we were waiting for it to be picked up. I didn't know what I was doing here. I was turning down work in London, not knowing what I was going to be doing. I mean, I was a mess when I came into that room, and I felt I pushed too hard, and I felt I did not bring my A game at all. To this day, I will maintain that, even though you challenge it. So that challenge is what I want to ask you about. Is we as actors, we go and we judge ourselves often as how good we felt the audition went. But I suspect, and you're not the only casting director, because I know casting directors have brought me back when I sometimes feel my previous performance hasn't been worthy of that. So it can't be just about the audition you're looking at. There must be something else that makes you a bit, like you said, your employers, like Meg Simon and stuff, saw something in you. What is it in actors? What can you tell actors who might put too much weight on the actual audition, you know? as opposed to the actors that they are, you know?
I mean, you know, at the risk of, you know, a terrible generalization, I think most actors are not the best judges of how the audition went. You know, I think that oftentimes when you sort of leave a room thinking, oh my God, let me just pick the egg from my face off. And that's the time that you're going to get a call back and probably get cast. And the time you walk out feeling very, very self-satisfied and really thrilled with how it all went is perhaps the time where you know, there's just a deafening silence and you're like, where's my phone call?
Yeah, 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock comes around, you're like checking the phone straight to voicemail. You know,
I don't think that there's a lot to be gained from examining the work that you just did in that 10 minutes or that 15 minutes in the audition studio. You know, I think an actor's work is very much on the front end. You know, you do your preparation, you do your research, you know, you get those words comfortable in your mouth, and then you walk in the door and you have to, in a way, just let go and say, whatever happens now, it is now up to the gods and goddesses of casting. And you do your best, and sometimes it will feel great, and other times it will feel miserable. And it's, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean, just because you feel terrible about it, it doesn't mean that it was terrible at all, or that there wasn't something that was valuable to us. You know, when we're in auditions, we're not just thinking about, oh, you know, are you the right person to play Ina Barbas? You know, we're thinking about, you know, 9,000 other projects that we're working on at the same time. And we're also thinking about, are you the right person to play Ina Barbas, you know, for Terrell McCraney on a three, you know, a three, I was gonna say 3 country, but Florida is not
another country. It is a 3 country. It felt like it.
You know, on a tour of a show that's going to go to 3 sort of major cities on 2 continents.
Yeah.
You know, are you the right person to play Ina Barbas in a very chambered production of Antony and Cleopatra? You know, there's a lot of things that sort of go into the decision making that actually, you know, are you going to be a good fit for a company that's going to be on the road? You know, are you going to be, you know, there's just all of these other sort of questions that have to be answered, as well as, you know, did you just sort of nail that speech?
Yeah.
Which, by the way, you did.
One of the most fun acting experiences for me. I really enjoyed playing that, and it's weird because I would never have, the first time I was approached for that, because I heard about that project in London before I moved to the States, I actually didn't feel I wanted to do it or feel I was right for it, you know, and then, you know, you come around to it and you're like, actually, this is actually pretty cool, you know. But I'm going to just pick on something you said, that actor's preparation for a casting director. I mean, it's a bit putting you on the spot, but if you had to tick a box that you would hope the actor did before they walked into the room, what are the sort of things you hope they've done before they walk into the room?
Read the play. I mean, that, you know, you'd be amazed at how often people show up not having read the play. And you've by not doing that, you have just taken away about 75% of the safety net you have to stand on. You know, auditioning is complicated and difficult, and, you know, it can be a very strange experience. And so as an actor, I think the best things you can do are figure out how to knit together that safety net for yourself that's going to support you while you're in the room. And if you walk in, you know, with 75% of it missing, you know, from the jump, then, you know, the chances are, you know, unless you are very, very lucky, the chances are that, you know, your audition will just stall, you know. And I think it's great to be invested, but it's also great to have other things in your life that feel as important as
Talk to us about that. That is, I'm so glad you brought that up yourself.
So when we, you know, so when you and I first met, Chuck, one of the things that, like, I was so taken with immediately was just how authentically yourself you seem to be.
Thank you.
You know, And to me, that is the thing that I'm interested in an actor's humanity, not just their technical skills. I'm interested in your journey through the world. I'm interested in, you know, who you are as a person, because, you know, the only thing that you have that is different from everybody else is your authentic self. There is no one else who's like you. And I think you have to approach everything from a very, very clear sense of who you are and how you connect to the material, rather than a sort of imagined connection based on ideas that you think a director may have or a writer may have. You know, one of the things that sort of would amaze me, you know, when I first started spending a lot of time in auditions, was how a lot of directors during the audition process were just beginning themselves to explore the play. And so they were filled with questions, not answers.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, a lot of particularly young actors walk into an audition and they'll say, what are you looking for? And it comes from a place of I think, of sort of wanting to please, of course. But the answer is often, I have no idea what I'm looking for. I only read the play 10 minutes before you did, you know. And so it's a great opportunity as an actor to express yourself. And the way that you interpret Ina Barbers may, in the end, not be what's interesting to a director, but at least you got to do it your way and do it to please you, rather than sort of getting sort of into that sort of spiral of like trying
to do what you think they want.
Right. Yeah. You cannot get inside anyone's mind but your own.
Yeah. I just imagine asking someone like Evo, what are you looking for? I mean, that's just the end of the audition before it even starts.
Yeah,
you know? And one more thing about casting before, because I want to touch back on what you said about humanity and who you are, because anyway, we'll touch that. But one more thing is, I remember wanting, this is me personally with you, resisting Edgar and wanting Edmund. and you talking to me and saying, I remember I was in Whole Foods and I called you and you were like, look, you know, you just bring in Edgar, just go bring your best. It's like, it's give it to Dan. Dan wants to see that, and encouraging one person to that. So I just want, it's one of the best decisions ever, because it was one of the biggest growing leaps in my acting career, playing a role that I didn't want, that I thought was unplayable, and then whatever. That sense of encouragement you give to actors, do you think that's an important part of the mandate as a casting director, as you work with people, to keep demanding that they grow also?
I mean, it's certainly exciting to be part of an actor's journey. You know, I do wonder, I'm trying to think back to sort of what was in my mind when we had that conversation, and you know, was it something way more self-serving than you are imagining, which is just that, you know, perhaps I thought you would be really amazing in the role and I wanted to see that, rather than it being, you know, sort of, you know, I do think, you know, Edgar's an interesting role because it's the less obvious, but in the end, I think the
heart of the story.
Most stunning of those two roles. I mean, you know, I kind of think that Edmund is a little bit sort of two-dimensional in comparison. And yeah, he's got a couple of good speeches, but other than that, you know, but the journey that Edgar goes on is epic and emotionally.
And it was draining, absolutely draining.
You could have played Edmund in your sleep,
right.
And it would have been a waste, you know, of all of the heart and that you bring to your work.
Oh my God, you're gonna bring me to tears. I'm gonna bring the focus back to you. One of the things I love about knowing you is seeing your wonderful relationship with your wife Edna. The two of you, I think, are just inspirational, and every time we get a chance to spend time with you, that's just so enriching. And of course, Edna's doing a lot of work in Puerto Rico with after the hurricanes and the storms, and just trying to build back that, you know, that community and stuff. And what would you, and so for me, I feel a big part of who you are, and part of why you do what you do so well, and part of why she does what she does so well, is the relationship you have, and investing in that, and questioning, re-examining your humanity, and then bringing that into your work. I mean, can you talk a little bit about that to us, about, especially for a lot of actors that right now are consumed, as it's, you know, normal and understandable with work and getting the job and getting the gig, about the investment in the other stuff also, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I've always thought that it was really, really important to have other things in your world that you feel passionately about. And, you know, Edna and I have been together for since 1996. And she has never been of the theatre, although she loves the theatre, which is fantastic.
And has pretty brilliant and front-footed opinions about
yes, indeed she does, which is great. You know, it's very, very
healthy
good to have
needed.
someone in my life who is completely honest about, you know, I get sometimes a little bit caught up in the work that I do, and you know, it's just good to have a perspective that's you know, creates a bit more of a sense of balance, you know. And also, you know, her sort of service work that she does, you know, in some ways, I feel like just by virtue of being married to her, I sort of get to bask in the glow of that without actually having to go to the hard and difficult places. But, you know, it is always, it's been so rewarding to have somebody in my life who has a really clear-eyed sense of all of the injustices in our world. And, you know, I think the great gift of working at the Public is that a lot of the work we do there is work that is very much focused towards politics, towards injustice. And I think that's where our lives do sort of mesh. But I'm, you know, I'm always in awe of people who do it in the real world as opposed to those of us that do it in the theatre.
Yeah, we feed off them, and in many ways we try to be them in the best way we can.
And it gives us perspective. It is not the end of the world if you don't get cast.
Yes,
you know,
that's the perspective.
It just means another opportunity is going to open up.
The bigger things happening.
Yeah.
All right, Heidi. Look, at this point, we have so many questions for you, so I'm going to reconnect with Michelle to feed us some of the questions that have come in since the chat started. Michelle.
Excellent.
Great. Yeah. So this first question I have is from Gabby, and
Hi, Gabby.
and she would like to know, what's a casting story you're particularly proud of?
Apart from me.
Yeah.
We've covered me.
Yes.
Moving on. Yeah.
Oh wow, that's a great question. I mean, you know, when you've been toiling, you know, in the off-Broadway theatre as long as I have, I've got to say there's a lot. You know, there are a lot of. But I'm gonna, you know, I don't know if this is actually an answer to the question, but it's something that I think about all the time, which is that there are actors who we love, you know, Jordan and I and Kate and the rest of the casting department, who we invite into audition all the time and who don't get cast, who do really, really well, often get called back and don't get cast. And sometimes this goes on with a particular actor for years and years. And there's an actor that I'm particularly thinking of who, you know, we just loved the minute we first met her. And so we just started bringing her in for everything. And probably, I don't know, was it 8 years, 10 years, something like that. And she would never be the one. Until suddenly one day she was. And she was cast in a production of a new play at the Public. But the thing that was so extraordinary about this actress was that every single time she came into audition, the director or the other people in the room would have no idea that this was maybe her 20th time through the door, without you know, being the person that was selected. And the fact that she would step in every time as if she was sort of newly birthed into the world was sort of remarkable to me. And I feel like, that was such a lesson in sort of how to sort of shed all of the sort of, self-judgment that I think all of us carry, when we face rejection. And also a testament to sort of the weird alchemy that is the casting process. I think that a part is I don't know, maybe the role and the actor sort of, are out there in the universe circling each other, and it takes this weird process that we've somehow we've inherited from prior generations called auditioning for that role to find the actor that is supposed to play it. Yeah, Gabby, that was a completely useless answer.
No, it was a very helpful one. I think it's brilliant because I'll just go back to your point that it took 8 to 10 years of coming back and refreshing and coming back open and hopeful, but letting it go and ready to come back again instead of the other thing that could easily happen, And yes. I think that was a great answer. All right, Michelle, next question.
Yeah, no, I would agree with Chuck. That was a really great answer. Okay, next question. This is from Vince. What are your feelings and advice about type? How important is knowing your type, and does that have value?
Hey, Vince. Type, I guess, is a word that I really try to steer away from using. We sort of say amongst ourselves, and you have to understand that, like, I'm only one casting director in quite a depth of field these days. So anything I say is really just coming from my own experience and how we sort of have created our sort of way of working at the public. But I think that your job as an actor is to think that you're right for everything. And my job as a casting director is to sort of winnow through, all of the work and know which are the opportunities that you are rightest for. But I think it can be a slippery slope, sort of putting limits on yourself. Because, the world, unfortunately, that we all work in is very much wired to limiting people and saying, this is the work that you can do. This is what we've seen you do, and you've been rewarded for doing this particular kind of work, and therefore that is the only work we are going to make available to you. So there's going to be a huge line of people who are going to put limits on you, and you should never be the first person in that line.
Yeah, I will say sometimes I'm guilty of casting myself, and stuff. You just see something and you assume how they're going to go with it anyway. And I think sometimes you're right, but a lot of the times that's you already creating a buffer for fear and a disappointment of not getting it, as opposed to just going in there and doing it, If you've called me in, if a casting director has called you in, they're not doing it just for, giggles, they're doing it because clearly they're looking for something they might not even know. You say the director sometimes doesn't know, sometimes casting, they're not sure where to go with it either. They're trying different options, right? Yeah.
That's right. That's right. I mean, there are some directors who are super, super clear about the world that they want to create. And then there are others who, so in those kinds of circumstances, you maybe need to bring in, a handful or 2 handfuls of actors for a part. But then there are other directors who their process is so different, and they really need to see, like, everybody that lives and breathes before they can make a decision.
Yeah. Next question, Michelle.
Okay. This question is from Mike. With so much casting happening through self-tapes now, a lot of theater as well, what would be some strong practices to keep in mind during these types of auditions?
It's a fantastic question, and something that we think about a lot more now than we ever did. I don't mean now during these sort of times of lockdown. I just mean, I guess, because technology has made it possible for actors to basically enter a casting process without physically being in the same place that we're in. So, 10 years ago, it would be super, super rare that we would, see more than 1 or 2 self-tapes. And now we spend, enormous amounts of time sitting at our desks and watching self-tapes. And we try to do it, we try to sort of recreate as much as we can sort of the feeling of actually being in an audition room with actors. So, you know, we'll have a schedule, you know, as if, you know, you were scheduled to come in for an appointment, and our assistants will have sort of banked all the self-tapes, and we'll sit and we'll watch 10 or 15 self-tapes in a morning, and write notes, and you know, really sort of try to sort of make it feel as analogous to a live audition as we possibly can. I mean, what, you know, one of the things that I think that is a real boon is that, you know, you now can be off working somewhere and also be part of a casting process. I mean, I will say it's quite rare that we've cast people from self-tapes without at least having some form of a live audition, but it's a massively helpful tool to be able to encourage an actor to say, hey, you know, on your day off, why don't you jump on a train and come up from DC, and we'll get you in to audition for the director on the Monday. Or, you know, there have been occasions where we've decided as an institution that we'll fly an actor in based on a self-tape to read for the director live. And without the self-tape, you know, we wouldn't have had that ability. So it's become a tool that is super, super valuable on our end. And I think, you know, creates a much more level platform for actors. That in terms of, you know, the actual self-tapes themselves, I am by no means an expert. I'm a bit of a Luddite, as most of the people that work with me would attest. But the one thing I know for sure is that, you know, as long as you've got pretty good light and pretty good sound, you really don't need to stress about the technical aspects of it. You know, because I think sometimes what happens is people get so caught up in that they forget the actual work at hand. And so I think it's really, really important just to focus on doing that work. You know, prepare.
And can I just ask,
please,
for self-tape for theater as opposed to film or TV, do you want people addressing and bringing things in for the camera, as it were, or do you prefer it, you know, a pretty wide shot where, as if they were in the room, they go for it? Does that make sense?
It does, and I think it depends a little bit on what the material requires.
Right.
So I was looking at some self-tapes the other day because I was prepping for a self-tape workshop I was doing, and the three tapes I picked were all very, very different in that regard. You know, the thing that united them all was that they were the work that the actors managed to do, even in that sort of slightly sort of weird context, was extraordinary work. And I would say, you know, one of the actors was a little bit gifted by the fact that the scene she was reading was it was a scene where the character was videoing herself.
Oh God.
So that was kind of amazing, you know. So it was sort of where the two things just came into sort of perfect alignment. The other one was a Shakespeare speech, and actually the actor sort of made this decision to sort of do it in quite a wide shot. He seemed to be standing in front of sort of a curtain of some kind, you know, like he wasn't in his apartment. He was someplace, maybe in a studio, I'm not sure. But it felt at the same time, like it felt theatrical, but deeply intimate at exactly the same time, which was lovely. And then the third one was for a contemporary play, and it was a scene that was like unbelievably, like an aria, a long aria of a scene that was, you know, that had all kinds of physical life to it, and loads of you know, just emotional explosion, and I think the actress that did this tape made an incredibly smart choice to scale everything, you know, to the camera. Right. And she was connecting to, she wasn't looking into the camera, she was connecting to the person, the other actor that was reading with her. But she managed to sort of be able to sort of navigate that incredibly difficult scene in a way that didn't feel like, you know.
Now you're throwing this at me. Now you're throwing this at me. Now you're throwing this at me. Yeah. Great. Next question, Michelle.
Yeah, so let's see. My next question is from Dan. What makes a good casting director? What kind of demeanor, personality does it take to meet hundreds of actors and choose the right one?
You know, it's a difficult question to answer, Dan, because, you know, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of casting directors in the world now, and we're all wired a little bit differently. But, you know, for me, the one thing that feels essential is that we must love actors and respect actors and have empathy for how difficult it is for actors to do the work they have to do. I mean, it's hard enough in the context of a rehearsal where you've already been gifted this amazing opportunity to do this work. But in the context of auditions, you know, like it seems to me that it's essential to sort of have a level of empathy. And I think, you know, it's not a surprise that a lot of casting directors were at some point in their lives performers. And that's why I think that there is, you know, for certainly all the casting directors that I sort of, you know, have, you know, respect for, are united by that sense of deep empathy with what the journey of actors are, particularly in the context of auditioning.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question, I think.
I'm going to throw in 2 more if that's okay.
Oh, 2 more. Okay, great.
What are your thoughts and feelings about pay-to-plays like one-on-one and that, like, because I know that's probably thrown at actors quite a bit. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for a long time, I was a little bit standoffish about that kind of work, but I've done a bunch of classes at one-on-one, which is, it's funny that that's the studio that you would highlight. But and I will tell you, I work my ass off. You know, I structure them in a way that is very, very specific and very, very much focused on it being a class. And I think the thing that it's really, really crucial for people to understand with that kind of work is that it is not an audition. It doesn't look anything like an audition. It's part of your development as an actor. And if you can see it in that way, if you can use it in that way, and if you can take a class with 10 or 12 other actors and you can learn from the work they're doing and learn from the work, you know, I think one of the things that, you know, a lot of actors never get to see is other actors doing audition scenes. And so in some ways it's a great sort of eye-opener for actors in class to see the different ways that actors approach material. It's very, very interesting. And I find one of the things that I love about the one-on-one classes is how supportive the groups are of each other. And we always do a 2-week masterclass, and Kate Murray and I do them together these days. And we use material that we do a lot of new work, but we also do Shakespeare auditioning masterclasses. And it's all the material we use is actual audition material from our sort of archives, and some of it is unbelievably difficult. So the real sort of point of it is to try to sort of demystify what the process is for actors and help actors you know, understand what's controllable, what isn't controllable, how to sort of navigate certain very specific challenges that are sometimes embedded in audition material. And we also try to have some fun with it too.
Yeah.
So I've really sort of changed my mind, but you know, I think, you know, again, you know, there are a million of these kinds of programs offered, and you have to be super, super careful about what you choose.
It's quality over the quantity of it, really.
Because it has cost you something to earn that money, and so you shouldn't spend it. It's someplace where you're not gonna actually be seen and in some way sort of.
And I think especially when you take those classes with a casting, that point you made about it's not an audition, you've got to just get away any sense of giving your best self in case they're casting something. Is actually about showing all the things that you're not comfortable with and that you're right, so they can help you fix it. You know what I mean? You know, and I think that switch is important.
Being vulnerable and trying things and failing and then trying something else. I mean, that's the sort of opportunity that you have ideally in those classes.
Yeah. Final question.
Final question, and I'm sure this is one that a lot of people would like to know. This is from Nikita. What's the best way for an actor to get on your radar?
Boom. The money question.
There's a lot of different ways. That's the good news. There isn't a single way. You know, and one of the things that's such a gift about working at the Public in particular, although there are other theatres that I'm sure, you know, people would say the same thing, but because we have such an incredible breadth of material, we can't just all the time be thinking about the same, you know, 20 actors. You know, each one of our projects demands almost a reinvention of our process, you know, with each project that we enter into. And so, you know, we can't rest on our laurels and just say, oh, you know, let's round up the usual suspects. And we have to be constantly deepening our sort of sense of knowledge of who's out there in the world, and particularly with young actors. And so we do that in a bunch of different ways. You know, we go and see a lot of theatre, which, you know, it means all sort of levels of theatre. And we try to meet as many people as possible for, you know, we used to do something called general auditions. So, you know, an actor might write to us, and then 6 months later, we might dig that letter out of a file and say, oh, let's have some people come in and do some monologues for us. In the more recent era, that got harder and harder because we just didn't, you know, the programming at the public was just growing and growing and growing with such speed that it was very, very difficult for us to carve out that time. So then what ended up happening is that on any given project, we would try to meet people in what we call pre-screens. And apologies if I'm over-explaining this to anyone, but a pre-screen is when a casting director or directors will meet actors before bringing them into audition for a director. And it's a great way for us now. It's a fantastic tool to get to know actors who either we don't know at all, or we may know in one very specific world, but perhaps we've never heard their Shakespeare. So we do that a lot now, and that's doing loads of pre-screens for each project has kind of taken over from the general auditions that we used to do. And so, you know, yes, so we're bringing you in for our mobile, you know, Cymbeline, but we're not just thinking of you for Cymbeline. We're meeting you, we're learning a little bit about you, and then we're figuring out different ways to connect with you.
So the two things I'm going to take away from that is that if you try to arrange and get to as many of these pre-screens as possible if you can. If there's a long wait between the request and coming in, don't despair, because as Heidi says, sometimes it takes time. And don't think of that. If you do get that audition, don't think not hearing back doesn't mean there isn't something else down the road. You know, basically, I feel those are like some of the points that have come out of that. But the main thing is to make sure you reach out, because there are many, many avenues to getting into the door, basically, and all that. All right, so Michelle, can you do me a big favor? Can you tell everyone can everyone unmute themselves and just give Heidi a round of applause for being absolutely amazing? You know, thank you so much.
So much, Heidi.
That was awesome.
Thank you.
It's been amazing. Secondly, it is Michelle's birthday, so everyone wish her a happy birthday. Happy birthday,
Michelle.
Hey.
Thank
And
you. Happy birthday.
So good.